Detective James Robinson was having one of those rare, peaceful Saturday afternoons. No emergency calls, no late-night stakeouts, just a simple drive back from his nephew's baseball game. He'd promised his sister he'd be there. And seeing little Anthony hit his first home run made the 2-hour drive completely worth it. James had changed out of his usual work clothes into something comfortable, a simple gray hoodie and jeans. After spending most of his week in suits for his job with the Secret Service, casual clothes felt like freedom. He rolled down the windows of his black sedan and let the cool air flow through as he drove through the quiet suburban streets of Maplewood Heights. The neighborhood was picture perfect, with its manicured lawns and expensive cars sitting in driveways. James couldn't help but think about how different this area looked compared to where he grew up. Every house here probably cost more than most people made in 5 years. But he wasn't bitter about it. He'd worked hard to get where he was, and someday maybe he'd live in a place like this too. He was stopped at a red light, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel to the jazz music playing softly on the radio, when he noticed the police car pull up behind him. James glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the officer inside looking directly at him. The light turned green, and James drove forward normally, staying exactly at the speed limit. 2 blocks later, the red and blue lights flashed. James felt his stomach drop slightly, but he stayed calm. He'd been pulled over before. It happened to black men more often than it should, and he knew the drill. He pulled over carefully, put the car in park, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen clearly. Officer Ray Collins approached the driver's side window with a swagger that James recognized immediately. 20-year veteran, probably never worked outside this wealthy suburb, and definitely someone who thought his badge made him more important than he actually was. "License and registration," Collins said without any greeting. His tone was cold and suspicious from the very first word. "Of course, officer," James replied politely. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Collins snorted. "You were driving erratically. Seemed like you were looking around at houses, maybe casing the neighborhood." James felt a flash of anger but kept his voice steady. "I was just driving through, sir. I was coming back from my nephew's baseball game." "Sure you were," Collins said, clearly not believing a word. "This your car?" "Yes, sir, it is." James reached slowly for his wallet, making sure to announce every movement. "I'm reaching for my license in my wallet," he said clearly. Collins watched him like a hawk, one hand resting on his weapon. "Real slow now." James handed over his license and registration. Collins looked at the documents, then back at James, then at the documents again. His expression grew more suspicious. "James Robinson," Collins read aloud. "This address says you live downtown. Long way from home, aren't you?" "Like I said, I was visiting family." "Uh-huh." Collins walked back to his patrol car, taking much longer than necessary to run the license check. James could see him in the rearview mirror, talking on his radio and occasionally looking up at James's car. When Collins returned, he had a citation book in his hand. "Mr. Robinson, I'm citing you for failure to maintain lane, driving below the speed limit in a manner that impedes traffic, and failure to signal when changing lanes." James blinked in disbelief. "Officer, I haven't changed lanes once since you've been behind me, and I've been going exactly the speed limit. Are you arguing with me?" Collins's voice took on a threatening tone. "No, sir. I'm just confused about the charges." "Well, let me clear up your confusion," Collins said with a smirk. "Maybe you're not used to driving in nice neighborhoods like this. Maybe you got distracted looking at all the expensive houses and cars. Maybe you should stick to your own area where you know how to drive properly." The words hit James like a slap, but he maintained his composure. He'd dealt with officers like Collins before, though usually not this blatantly. "I understand, officer. Now I could search your vehicle," Collins continued, "since you were acting suspiciously. You got anything in there I should know about? Drugs, weapons, stolen property?" "No, sir. Nothing illegal in my car. Mind if I take a look anyway?" James knew his rights. "Actually, sir, I'd prefer if you didn't search my vehicle without probable cause." Collins' face darkened. "Oh, so now you're a lawyer too? You think you know the law better than me?" "No, sir. I'm just exercising my constitutional rights." "Your constitutional rights?" Collins repeated mockingly. "Well, here's what's going to happen, Mr. Constitutional Rights. You're getting these citations, and I better not see you driving through this neighborhood again, unless you have legitimate business here. Do I make myself clear?" James looked up at Collins and for a moment considered telling him exactly who he was and what his legitimate business might include, protecting people a lot more important than a small-town police officer. But he'd learned long ago that escalating situations like this rarely ended well, especially on the side of the road. "Yes, sir. Crystal clear." Collins handed him the citations with a satisfied grin. "Have a nice day, Mr. Robinson, and drive safe on your way back downtown." As Collins walked away, James looked at the citations. 3 different traffic violations, each one completely fabricated. The total fines would cost him nearly $600, not to mention the points on his license and the potential impact on his insurance. James sat in his car for a moment after Collins drove away, taking deep breaths and trying to process what had just happened. In his line of work, he'd seen the worst of humanity. People who threatened the safety of government officials, domestic terrorists, international criminals. But somehow, this casual, everyday racism felt just as ugly. He started his car and drove away slowly, making absolutely sure to signal every turn and stay exactly at the speed limit. As he left Maplewood Heights behind, James made a decision. He wasn't going to just pay these bogus tickets and let Collins think he could treat people this way. Some battles were worth fighting, even when you could easily afford to walk away. This was going to be one of them. 3 weeks later, James stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his navy blue tie for the 3rd time. The court hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning, and he wanted to look professional but not overdressed. He'd chosen a simple charcoal gray suit, nothing too flashy but well-tailored enough to show he took this seriously. His wife Jennifer had tried to convince him to just pay the tickets and move on. $600 isn't worth the hassle, she'd said over breakfast. You've got better things to do with your time. But James couldn't let it go. It wasn't about the money. Those $600 was nothing to sneeze at. It was about principle. It was about Officer Collins thinking he could fabricate charges and get away with it just because he wore a badge. Besides, James had told Jennifer while buttering his toast, what if the next person Collins pulls over can't afford a good lawyer? What if they can't take time off work to fight bogus charges? Someone needs to hold guys like him accountable. The Maplewood Municipal Court building was smaller than James had expected. It looked more like a converted office building than a courthouse, with bland beige walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick. James arrived 15 minutes early and checked in with the clerk, a tired-looking woman who barely glanced up from her computer screen. "Robinson versus the City of Maplewood," she said mechanically. "Take a seat. They'll call your case when it's time." The waiting area had about 20 plastic chairs arranged in rows like a doctor's office. James took a seat in the back and looked around. Most of the other people waiting appeared to be there for similar traffic violations, a mix of ages and races, all looking slightly annoyed to be spending their morning in court. That's when Officer Collins walked in. Collins was in full uniform, his chest puffed out like he owned the place. He nodded to the clerk like they were old friends, then scanned the waiting area. When his eyes landed on James, his expression shifted to something between amusement and disdain. "Well, well," Collins said loudly enough for others to hear. "Look who decided to show up and waste everyone's time." James kept his expression neutral. "Good morning, Officer Collins." Collins walked over, his boots clicking against the linoleum floor. "You know, Robinson, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've seen hundreds of guys like you come through here thinking they're going to outsmart the system. I'm just here to present my side of the story," James replied calmly. "Your side of the story," Collins laughed. "That's rich. You think dressing up in a fancy suit is going to change what happened? You think the judge is going to believe you over a sworn police officer?" A few other people in the waiting area had started paying attention to the conversation. James noticed an elderly woman looking concerned and a young man with a speeding ticket trying to pretend he wasn't listening. "Look," Collins continued, sitting down in the chair next to James uninvited, "let me give you some free advice. Plead guilty, pay your fines, and go home. Don't embarrass yourself trying to play lawyer when you're clearly out of your league." "I appreciate the advice," James said, "but I'm going to let the judge decide." Collins shook his head like he was talking to a stubborn child. "You people always think you're special. You think the rules don't apply to you. Well, here's a newsflash, they do. And when I get up on that witness stand and tell the judge exactly what I saw that day, your little performance in your Sunday best isn't going to matter one bit." James felt his jaw tighten but kept his voice level. "We'll see." "Yeah, we will see," Collins said, standing up. "I hope you took the day off work for this because you're going to be here for a while, and at the end of it all, you're still going to owe the city $600 plus court costs now." Collins walked away to chat with another officer who had just arrived. James could hear fragments of their conversation, something about people who don't know their place and waste of taxpayer money. The other officer glanced over at James and chuckled. About 30 minutes later, the bailiff called for everyone to stand as Judge Patricia Martinez entered the courtroom. She was a serious-looking woman in her 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Good morning," Judge Martinez said as she settled behind the bench. "We have several traffic cases on the docket today. I want to remind everyone that this court operates efficiently, so please be prepared when your case is called." James watched as the first few cases were processed. Most people pled guilty and paid their fines without much discussion. One woman tried to argue that she hadn't been speeding, but without any evidence beyond her word against the officers, Judge Martinez upheld the citation. "Next case," the bailiff announced. "Robinson versus the City of Maplewood." James stood up and walked to the defendant's table. Officer Collins took his place at the prosecution table, looking confident and relaxed. The city prosecutor, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, shuffled through his papers. "Mr. Robinson," Judge Martinez said, "you're charged with failure to maintain lane, impeding traffic by driving below the speed limit, and failure to signal when changing lanes. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Judge Martinez nodded. "Very well. Officer Collins, please take the witness stand." Collins walked to the witness stand with the confidence of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. He was sworn in and settled into the chair like he was getting comfortable in his favorite recliner. "Officer Collins," the prosecutor began, "please tell the court what you observed on the afternoon in question." Collins cleared his throat and began his testimony with the air of someone telling a well-rehearsed story. "Your Honor, I was on patrol in the Maplewood Heights area when I observed the defendant's vehicle driving erratically. He was weaving slightly within his lane, driving approximately 5 miles per hour below the posted speed limit, and appeared to be distracted by something outside his vehicle." James took notes as Collins spoke, comparing the officer's testimony to what had actually happened. The defendant changed lanes twice without signaling. Collins continued, "and seemed to be paying more attention to the houses in the neighborhood than to his driving. Based on my experience, this behavior indicated either impaired driving or someone unfamiliar with proper driving procedures. Did you observe anything else that concerned you?" The prosecutor asked. "Yes, sir. When I initiated the traffic stop, the defendant appeared agitated and argumentative. He questioned my authority to stop him and seemed reluctant to provide his documentation." James felt his anger rising but forced himself to remain calm. Every word Collins was saying was either a complete lie or a gross distortion of the truth. "In your professional opinion," the prosecutor continued, "did the defendant's driving pose a safety risk to other motorists?" "Absolutely," Collins said without hesitation. "Erratic driving in a residential area puts everyone at risk. Children playing, other drivers, pedestrians. That's why these traffic laws exist, and that's why I had no choice but to cite the defendant for these violations." Collins looked directly at James as he finished his testimony, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The message was clear. This is how the game is played, and I always win. But James had news for Officer Collins. This game was far from over. Judge Martinez leaned back in her chair as Officer Collins finished his testimony. The courtroom was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of papers. James watched the judge's face, trying to read her expression, but she maintained the neutral look that probably came from years of hearing similar cases. "Officer Collins," Judge Martinez said, "you mentioned that Mr. Robinson changed lanes twice without signaling. Can you be more specific about when and where these lane changes occurred?" Collins straightened up slightly, his confidence unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor. The first lane change occurred approximately 2 blocks before I initiated the stop. The defendant moved from the right lane to the left lane without signaling. Then, about a block later, he changed back to the right lane, again without proper signaling." James made another note. He hadn't changed lanes even once during the entire time Collins had been following him. He'd stayed in the same right lane from the moment he noticed the patrol car until he was pulled over. And you observed the defendant driving below the speed limit for how long? The judge continued. For at least 3 blocks, Your Honor. The speed limit in that area is 35 miles per hour, and I clocked him at approximately 30 miles per hour. In my experience, this type of driving behavior often indicates someone who's either impaired or unfamiliar with the area, and possibly engaged in criminal activity. The prosecutor nodded approvingly. Your Honor, Officer Collins is a 20-year veteran of the Maplewood Police Department with an exemplary record. His observations were thorough and professional, and the defendant clearly violated multiple traffic laws. Judge Martinez turned to James. Mr. Robinson, you may cross-examine the witness. James stood up, his notepad in hand. He'd never cross-examined a witness before, but his years of observing interrogations had taught him a few things about asking the right questions. Officer Collins, James began, you testified that I changed lanes twice without signaling. Is that correct? That's correct. And you're certain about this because you were directly behind me observing my vehicle? Yes, I was following your vehicle and had a clear view of your actions. James nodded. How long were you following my vehicle before you initiated the traffic stop? Collins paused for just a moment. Approximately 4 to 5 blocks. And during this entire time you maintained visual contact with my vehicle? Yes. Officer Collins, do you have a dash cam in your patrol vehicle? Another pause, slightly longer this time. Yes, all our vehicles are equipped with dashboard cameras. And was your dash cam recording during this traffic stop? Collins's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The dash cam system was experiencing technical difficulties that day. Technical difficulties, James repeated. So there's no video record of my alleged lane changes or erratic driving? No, but my testimony as a sworn officer should be sufficient. Judge Martinez looked up from her notes. Officer Collins, how often do these technical difficulties occur with the dash cam systems? Not very often, Your Honor. It was an unusual occurrence, James continued. Officer Collins, you testified that I was driving 5 miles per hour below the speed limit. Did you use radar to clock my speed? No, I estimated your speed based on my experience. So you don't have any technical documentation of my speed, just your estimate? That's correct, but I've been doing this for 20 years. I can accurately estimate vehicle speeds. I see, James said. And you testified that I appeared distracted and was looking at houses in the neighborhood. How could you determine what I was looking at from your position behind my vehicle? Collins's jaw tightened slightly. Body language, head movements. I could see you turning your head to look around. But you couldn't actually see my eyes or determine exactly what I was looking at. I could see enough to know you weren't paying full attention to your driving. James flipped through his notes. Officer Collins, you also testified that I was argumentative and agitated during the traffic stop. Is that correct? Yes, you questioned my authority and seemed reluctant to cooperate. When you approached my vehicle, what was the first thing you said to me? Collins hesitated. I asked for your license and registration. Did you tell me why I was being stopped? I explained the violations. Actually, you told me I was driving erratically and seemed to be casing the neighborhood. Isn't that correct? I may have used those words, yes. And when I asked why I was pulled over, you said I was looking around at houses like I might be casing the neighborhood. Do you remember that? Collins's face was starting to show signs of irritation. I was investigating suspicious behavior. What specifically was suspicious about someone driving through a public neighborhood? The way you were driving, your speed? Your attention to the houses rather than the road? But Officer Collins, you just testified that you couldn't actually see what I was looking at from your position behind my vehicle. How could you determine I was paying attention to houses rather than the road? The prosecutor started to object, but Judge Martinez waved him off. Let the witness answer. Collins was quiet for a moment. Based on my experience and training, I could tell you were distracted. Officer Collins, during our interaction, I called you as multiple times, didn't I? Yes, I believe so. And I kept my hands visible on the steering wheel when you approached? Yes. And I immediately provided my license and registration when requested? You did provide them, yes. So when you described me as argumentative and agitated, you were referring to the fact that I asked why I was being stopped, and that I declined your request to search my vehicle. Collins's face was getting red now. You were being difficult. I was exercising my constitutional rights, wasn't I, Officer Collins? I suppose you could put it that way. James looked at his notes one more time. Officer Collins, in your 20 years of experience, how many traffic stops have you made in the Maplewood Heights neighborhood? Hundreds. And what percentage of those stops involved African American drivers? The prosecutor shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? I'll allow it, Judge Martinez said. Please answer the question, Officer Collins. Collins looked uncomfortable. I don't keep track of drivers by race. But you would agree that Maplewood Heights is a predominantly white affluent neighborhood? I suppose so. And you would agree that seeing an African American man driving through that neighborhood might stand out to you? I stop vehicles based on traffic violations, not race. But you did testify that I seemed out of place in the neighborhood, didn't you? Collins was quiet for a long moment. I said you appeared to be unfamiliar with the area. Based on what evidence? Your driving behavior. The driving behavior that you've admitted you have no video or radar documentation of. I observed what I observed. James closed his notepad. No further questions, Your Honor. As James returned to his seat, he could see that Collins looked less confident than when he'd started his testimony. The officer's story had holes in it, and those holes were starting to show. But James knew that pointing out inconsistencies in Collins's testimony might not be enough. He needed to present his own version of events, and when he did, he was going to have to decide whether to reveal who he really was. The moment of truth was coming, and James could feel his heart starting to beat faster. In a few minutes, he would either walk out of this courtroom as just another citizen who got railroaded by a corrupt cop, or he would turn this entire proceeding on its head. Collins was still sitting on the witness stand, looking at James with a mixture of anger and uncertainty. The cocky confidence he'd displayed earlier was starting to crack, and James could see doubt creeping into the officer's eyes. Good, James thought. Let him wonder what's coming next. Mr. Robinson, Judge Martinez said, you may call your first witness or testify on your own behalf. James stood up, straightening his tie one final time. Your Honor, I'd like to testify on my own behalf. Very well. Please approach the witness stand. As James walked past Officer Collins, who was returning to his seat at the prosecution table, he caught the officer's slight smirk. Collins clearly believed his testimony had been solid enough to secure a conviction. After all, it was the word of a sworn police officer against just another defendant trying to talk his way out of a ticket. The bailiff swore James in, and he settled into the witness chair. From this angle, he could see the entire courtroom. Judge Martinez looking attentive, the prosecutor shuffling through his papers, and Officer Collins leaning back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who thought the game was already won. Mr. Robinson, James began, addressing Judge Martinez directly. I'd like to start by giving you an accurate account of what actually happened on the afternoon in question. Judge Martinez nodded. Please proceed. Your Honor, I was driving home from my nephew's baseball game in Riverside. I took Route 15 to avoid highway traffic, which brought me through Maplewood Heights. I was driving exactly the speed limit, staying in the right lane, and had not changed lanes even once when Officer Collins began following me. James spoke clearly and calmly, making sure his voice carried to every corner of the small courtroom. I noticed the patrol car behind me at a red light. When the light turned green, I continued driving normally. I was not looking at houses or acting suspiciously. I was simply driving through the neighborhood on a public road. Can you describe the traffic stop itself? Judge Martinez asked. When Officer Collins approached my vehicle, his first words were license and registration. When I asked why I was being stopped, he told me I was driving erratically and that it seemed like I was casing the neighborhood. Your Honor, I had never changed lanes. I was driving at the speed limit and I was simply passing through the area. James paused, glancing over at Collins, who was starting to look less comfortable. During the stop, I remained respectful and compliant. I called Officer Collins, sir. I kept my hands visible and I immediately provided my documentation when requested. The only time I questioned anything was when he asked to search my vehicle without probable cause, and I politely declined, which is my constitutional right. Mr. Robinson, Judge Martinez said, Officer Collins testified that you changed lanes twice without signaling. Can you address that specifically? Your Honor, I did not change lanes at all during the time Officer Collins was following me. I remained in the right lane from the moment I noticed his patrol car until I pulled over. This is something that could easily be verified if Officer Collins's dashcam had been working properly. The prosecutor looked up from his papers. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is speculating about what the dashcam might have shown. Sustained, Judge Martinez said. Please stick to what you personally observed, Mr. Robinson. Of course, Your Honor. I can only tell you that I did not change lanes, I was not driving erratically, and I was not acting suspiciously. I was simply a citizen driving through a public neighborhood. James reached into his jacket pocket to pull out his notebook, where he'd written down the timeline of events. As he did, Officer Collins's voice cut through the courtroom. Oh, come on, Collins said with a derisive laugh. What are you going to pull out now? Some fake witness statement? Maybe a made-up alibi? Judge Martinez's head snapped toward Collins. Officer Collins, you will not speak unless you are asked a direct question. But Collins was on a roll now, his frustration and arrogance getting the better of him. Your Honor, I've seen this 100 times. They dress up, they practice their little speeches, they think they can fool everyone with their acting, but at the end of the day it's still just another. Officer Collins, Judge Martinez's voice was sharp. That is enough. You will remain silent or you will be held in contempt of court. James felt a cold anger wash over him, but he also felt something else. Clarity. Collins had just shown everyone in the courtroom exactly who he really was. The mask had slipped, and the prejudice that had motivated this entire ordeal was now visible for everyone to see. Your Honor, James said calmly, I was simply reaching for my notes, but since Officer Collins seems interested in my credentials, perhaps this would be an appropriate time to present proper identification. James reached back into his jacket and withdrew his official federal identification. The small leather case was unremarkable from the outside, but when he opened it and handed it to the bailiff, the courtroom's atmosphere changed instantly. The bailiff looked at the identification, blinked twice, and then walked it over to Judge Martinez. The judge took the case, examined it carefully, and her eyebrows rose slightly. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Martinez announced to the courtroom. The witness has identified himself as Detective James Robinson, United States Secret Service. The silence that followed was deafening. James could hear someone in the gallery gasp softly. The prosecutor's pen stopped moving across his notepad. And Officer Collins. Officer Collins looked like he'd just been hit by lightning. Your Honor, James continued in the same calm voice he'd been using throughout his testimony. I am a federal law enforcement officer with 12 years of experience. I have been trained in defensive driving, surveillance techniques, and threat assessment. I am intimately familiar with traffic laws, proper police procedures, and constitutional rights. Judge Martinez was studying James's credentials carefully. Detective Robinson, these appear to be authentic federal identification documents. They are. Your Honor, I work out of the Washington, D.C. field office, and I was returning from a personal visit to family when this incident occurred. James could see Collins in his peripheral vision. The officer had gone completely pale and was staring at James like he was seeing a ghost. The cocky confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by what looked like growing panic. Detective Robinson, Judge Martinez continued, given your law enforcement background, I assume you understand the seriousness of making false statements under oath. Absolutely, Your Honor. Everything I have testified to today is the complete truth. I did not change lanes, I was not driving erratically, and I was not acting suspiciously. I was simply driving through a public neighborhood while African American, which seemed to be sufficient probable cause for Officer Collins. The prosecutor was frantically flipping through his case files, probably wondering how this traffic stop had just turned into a potential federal civil rights case. Furthermore, Your Honor, James continued, Officer Collins's testimony contains several statements that are demonstrably false. He testified under oath that I changed lanes twice, that I was driving below the speed limit, and that I was argumentative and agitated. None of those statements are true. Judge Martinez looked from James to Officer Collins and back again. Detective Robinson, are you suggesting that Officer Collins committed perjury in my courtroom? James met her gaze directly. Your Honor, I'm suggesting that Officer Collins has provided testimony that is contradicted by the facts. Whether that constitutes perjury is a determination that others will have to make. The courtroom was so quiet that James could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Officer Collins looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. The prosecutor was no longer taking notes. He was just staring at James with an expression of complete bewilderment. Judge Martinez set James's credentials on her desk and looked directly at Officer Collins. "Officer Collins, do you have any questions for this witness?" Collins opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked like a man who suddenly realized he was standing on quicksand. "No questions, Your Honor," he finally managed to whisper. James remained in the witness chair, waiting for Judge Martinez's next instruction. But he could see in her eyes that the case was already over. The only question now was how far the consequences would reach. The truth was finally out, and there was no putting it back in the box. Judge Martinez removed her glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture that seemed to give her time to process what had just happened in her courtroom. When she put them back on, her expression was stern and focused. "Detective Robinson, you may step down from the witness stand." James returned to the defendant's table, but the dynamic in the courtroom had completely shifted. He was no longer just another citizen fighting traffic tickets. He was a federal law enforcement officer who had just exposed what appeared to be a pattern of misconduct by a local police officer, Officer Collins. Judge Martinez said, her voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "Please approach the bench." Collins stood up on unsteady legs and walked forward. Even from his seat, James could see that the officer's hands were shaking slightly. "Officer Collins," the judge continued, "I have just heard sworn testimony from a federal law enforcement officer that directly contradicts your earlier testimony. Detective Robinson has stated under oath that he did not change lanes during your traffic stop, that he was not driving erratically, and that he was not argumentative or agitated. How do you respond to these allegations?" Collins's voice was barely above a whisper. "Your Honor, I testified to what I observed." "What you observed," Judge Martinez repeated. "Officer Collins, are you aware that providing false testimony under oath in my courtroom is a felony, punishable by up to 5 years in prison?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And are you aware that violating someone's civil rights under color of authority is a federal crime?" Collins swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Martinez leaned forward. "Officer Collins, I want to give you one opportunity to reconsider your testimony. Is there anything you would like to clarify or correct?" The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Collins' heavy breathing. James watched as the officer struggled with what was probably the most important decision of his career. He could stick to his story and hope that somehow his word would still carry more weight than a federal agent's, or he could come clean and face the consequences. After what felt like an eternity, Collins spoke. "Your Honor, I may have been mistaken about some of the details." "Which details specifically, Officer Collins?" "The lane changes." "I may have been wrong about the lane changes. What about Detective Robinson's speed?" Another long pause. "I may have misjudged his speed as well. And his demeanor during the traffic stop?" Collins looked over at James, then back at the judge. "He was respectful throughout the encounter." Judge Martinez nodded grimly. "Officer Collins, return to your seat." As Collins walked back to the prosecution table, Judge Martinez turned her attention to the city prosecutor, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. "Counselor, does the city wish to proceed with these charges?" The prosecutor stood up quickly. "Your Honor, in light of the new information that has come to light, the city moves to dismiss all charges against Detective Robinson." "Motion granted," Judge Martinez said immediately. "All charges against Detective Robinson are hereby dismissed." She turned back to James. "Detective Robinson, I want to personally apologize for what you experienced today. The behavior you described is completely unacceptable and does not reflect the values of this court or this community." James stood up. "Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate the court's fairness in handling this matter. However," Judge Martinez continued, "I want you to know that this matter will not end here. Officer Collins, I'm referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential perjury charges. I am also forwarding my report to the Maplewood Police Department's Internal Affairs Division and to the FBI's Civil Rights Division." Collins's face went completely white. The consequences that had seemed like distant possibilities just minutes ago were suddenly very real and very immediate. "Furthermore," the judge added, "I am ordering that all of Officer Collins's recent traffic stops be reviewed to determine if there is a pattern of misconduct. This court will not tolerate officers who abuse their authority or target citizens based on race or any other protected characteristic." Judge Martinez banged her gavel. This court is adjourned. As people began filing out of the courtroom, James gathered his papers and prepared to leave. Officer Collins remained seated at the prosecution table, staring straight ahead like he was in shock. The prosecutor approached James as he headed toward the exit. "Detective Robinson, I want to apologize on behalf of the city. This should never have happened." "I appreciate that," James replied, "but I hope you understand that this isn't just about me. How many other people has Officer Collins treated this way? How many people couldn't afford to take time off work to fight bogus charges? How many people didn't have the resources or knowledge to defend themselves?" The prosecutor nodded soberly. "We're going to find out. I promise you that." As James walked through the courthouse lobby, he pulled out his phone to call his wife. Jennifer answered on the second ring. "How did it go?" she asked. "All charges dismissed," James said. "But that's just the beginning." "What do you mean?" James pushed through the courthouse doors and stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight. "Let's just say Officer Collins is going to have a very different conversation with Internal Affairs than he was expecting." 3 hours later, James was back home, sitting at his kitchen table with his laptop open. He'd already started typing his formal complaint to the FBI's Civil Rights Division. The incident with Collins wasn't just about one bad traffic stop. It was part of a larger pattern of discriminatory policing that needed to be addressed. His phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but with a Washington, D.C. area code. "Detective Robinson, this is Captain Sarah Chen from the Maplewood Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. I understand there was an incident today involving one of our officers." "Yes, ma'am. Officer Ray Collins. Detective Robinson, I want you to know that we take these allegations very seriously. Officer Collins has been suspended pending a full investigation. We would like to schedule a formal interview with you as soon as possible." "Of course, Captain. I'm also filing a complaint with the FBI Civil Rights Division." "That's absolutely your right, and frankly, it's probably appropriate given the circumstances." "Detective Robinson, can I ask you something off the record?" "Sure." "How long do you think Officer Collins has been behaving this way?" James considered the question. Based on his comfort level with lying under oath and his assumption that his word would automatically be believed over mine, I'd say this has been going on for a while. That's what I was afraid of. We're going to be reviewing every traffic stop he's made in the past 2 years. If we find a pattern of discriminatory enforcement, there will be serious consequences. 2 weeks later, James received a call from Captain Chen with an update. The investigation had revealed that Collins had disproportionately targeted minority drivers in traffic stops, often for vague or questionable violations. More troubling, several of those drivers had complained about Collins's conduct, but their complaints had been dismissed or ignored. "Detective Robinson," Captain Chen said, "Officer Collins has been terminated from the Maplewood Police Department. The district attorney is also moving forward with perjury charges. Additionally, the city is implementing new policies for traffic stops, including mandatory dashcam recordings and bias training for all officers." James felt a sense of satisfaction, but also sadness. It shouldn't have taken a federal agent getting pulled over for these problems to be addressed. 6 months later, James was invited to speak at the Maplewood Police Department's bias training seminar. As he stood in front of a room full of officers, he saw some who looked genuinely interested in learning and others who seemed resentful about having to be there. "I want to be clear about something," James began. "I didn't reveal my identity that day in court to embarrass Officer Collins or to get special treatment. I revealed it because his testimony was false and someone needed to hold him accountable for that. But here's the thing. I shouldn't have had to be a federal agent for my rights to be respected. Every citizen deserves to be treated with dignity and fairness, regardless of what they do for a living or what they look like." He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many officers as possible. "The badge you wear gives you authority, but it also gives you responsibility. You have the power to make someone's day better or worse, to protect their rights or violate them. That's a tremendous responsibility, and it's one that should never be taken lightly." After the training session, a young officer approached James. "Detective Robinson, I wanted to thank you for what you did. I've seen officers like Collins, and I've never known how to speak up about it." "Speaking up is hard," James replied, "but staying silent makes you complicit. The good officers need to hold the bad ones accountable, or else the whole system loses credibility." As James drove home that evening, he thought about Officer Collins, who was now facing federal civil rights charges and would likely never work in law enforcement again. He didn't take any pleasure in the man's downfall, but he knew that consequences were necessary for change to happen. The traffic stop that had started as a routine drive home from his nephew's baseball game had turned into something much larger, a reminder that justice sometimes requires ordinary people to take extraordinary stands, and that the truth, no matter how long it takes to emerge, has a power all its own.